Okay, welcome back to part 2 of lecture number 1 on the counseling process. We'll now continue our conversations focused on communication and counseling. It's important to recognize that communication is the essence of what we do as counselors. And the communication that takes place in a counselor-client interaction is not only verbal but nonverbal as well. So communication is really at the core of what we do. Communication, particularly our nonverbal communication, conveys warmth and it conveys genuineness, it conveys affirmation. And so it's really important that we think critically about our ways of communication as well as the ways in which we hear what is communicated to us by our clients. As it relates to communication, it occurs when messages are encoded and decoded. In the counseling process, many mechanisms of coding and decoding of information takes place. And the coding and decoding of information really takes place on both the part of the counselor as well as the client. There are times in which the client is the encoder and we are the receiver or the decoder. And there are other times in which the counselor is in the position of encoding information and the client is decoding information. So it's really important to understand the ways in which we communicate to clients and the ways in which our clients communicate to us. When we are communicating, the client is receiving the information and decoding information. When the client is the communicator, we are the receiver of the information and thus must decode and arrive at meaning that is being conveyed to us by the client. Miscommunication can occur due to either inaccurately composed messages or by unrecognized or misperceived messages. So we have to understand that there are times in which our means of communication might go awry. Sometimes there's a miscommunication, and the miscommunication might be in inaccurately understanding the messages that were conveyed. It might be situations that we're totally unfamiliar with. For example, if we have a client that comes from a totally different culture and they're sharing information with us and we're not familiar with that culture, this information may be unrecognized. So in situations such as this, for me, I always say to the client, tell me what that means for you. So if the client says something and I'm not sure what is being conveyed, I might say, tell me more about this situation or help me to better understand the situation in which you just described. There are other situations in which we are receiving or decoding information from the client and we may misperceive the information. For example, a client may provide certain kinds of information to us, but we may perceive it from one vein, or we might see it as being something that is sad or an unhappy experience. And in actuality, it might be a positive experience. And let's take, for example, a client shares with you that over the weekend their grandfather died. And you, as the counselor, feeling empathic, you might say, I can imagine that was your weekend was pretty sad hearing about the loss of your grandfather. And the client might say, well, no, in actuality, we really were happy that he went on to another life because after all, he had been suffering quite a bit. And we believe that his death is actually a celebration because he's going to a better place. So this is an example of how we might misperceive the information that the client is sharing with us. But it's through the exchange of information that we receive clarity and a better understanding. Communication in counseling is both verbal and nonverbal. There are certain cultures that put far more emphasis on nonverbal or contextual kinds of information. And there are some cultures that place more value on verbal communication. For example, with certain ethnicities, they look at the nonverbals. They look at the way in which a person says what they say. They look at whether they're smiling, the tone of voice. In some cultures, they don't pay as much attention to the nonverbals. They focus more on the non-contextual, more verbal kinds of information. So what you say is more important than how you say it. Whereas for others, they focus more on the nonverbals. So think about who you are as an individual and the way in which you receive or prefer to receive information. Among colleagues, we always make this talk about this quote, "Show me who you are and I'll believe it." And the part is show me, and the show me is the nonverbal contextual kind of information. And so we don't focus so much on what the person is saying to us, but we focus on how a person is showing us certain information. So it's important to recognize here that nonverbal communication carries a lot of weight. A lot of weight. It conveys a lot of information to our clients. As it relates to communication, you begin to work by deciphering or decoding information that the client is communicating to us. When the client conveys this information and we are able to decipher it and properly understand it, it gives the client a certain level of comfort. And the reason that this process facilitates comfort is because, number one, it's letting the client know that you are hearing them. And number two, it also conveys to the client that you're paying attention. So the client gains comfort in knowing that you're hearing them as well as you are listening to them. So first you're listening and you're hearing, really hearing the essence of what they're saying to you. You're also encouraging the client to enter into the world of a helping world by understanding that when you share information, I am hearing you, I'm understanding you, and through this process of hearing and understanding, I can help you. So it's through this communication process that the client feels comfortable in moving into the world of helping or receiving help. The client focus is twofold. The client is focused on how to read information and how to interpret meaning. Also, how to monitor his or her own issues or feelings. And so what we're doing in the communication process is modeling to the client what healthy communication is. Healthy communication is a process of listening and also a process of understanding. And through this process, the client too learns the importance of listening and interpreting. So when we think of communication and the importance of communication, we have to recognize nonverbal skills of counseling. Because oftentimes before one word is exchanged between the client and the counselor, there are nonverbal cues that the client will pick up on and read. It might be from as simple as when the client calls in to seek therapeutic services from your office, the person who is receiving that call, the way in which the person is being responded to in a warm, engaging voice, versus the client calls into your office and they're being greeted by a secretary who might not be as friendly or cordial. This begins the nonverbal interaction. Nearly 2/3 of the meaning in any social situation is derived from nonverbal cues. So if you think about it, nonverbal communication plays an enormous role in our ability to relate to the client. 2/3, which means that only 1/3 of our communication with our clients is based upon verbal exchange, the verbal information that we convey. So if you take nothing else from our discussion on communication, it has to do with the importance of nonverbal communication skills. There are essential elements of nonverbal communication. So what are they? First of all, the nonverbal communication conveys a safe, welcoming, and comfortable environment. So just think about it. You go to someone's home, and the way in which they greet you when you knock on the door and they open it says whether they are happy to have you. And so through this nonverbal exchange, with a smile, with a nice handshake, with attentive body language, this is conveying to the client that it is a safe, welcoming, and comfortable environment where they will be listened to and attended to for however long that they're in your environment. The second element that is essential is appropriate facial expression and eye contact. It's important that you maintain eye contact to convey to the client that you are listening or you're paying attention to them. If you're the kind of counselor who might stare out the window or stare at the pictures on your wall, or even stare at your notepad because you're feverishly taking notes, that conveys to the client that you're more concerned with other things than with them. So eye contact is very important. Sometimes you might scribble down a word or a phrase so that you can remind yourself to come back to it. But by and large, when the client is in your presence, you want to give them eye contact. You want to attend to them and give them the attention. And even when I worked in settings where I was obtaining a lot of factual information, for me, what I would do is, in that exchange, I would have a working understanding of the kind of information that I needed to ascertain from the client, and then I would engage the client in more of an interpersonal communication rather than a fact-finding, specific, closed-ended information-seeking exchange. Because when you obtain information through closed-ended, fact-finding, fill in the blank or answer the question formats, you limit the kind and quality of information that you receive from the client. You also want to maintain appropriate facial expressions. And I'm not sure how many of you can recognize or think back to people that you know, and when you're talking with them, they might have a frown on their face. And in actuality, they're not frowning at you. That might be their way in which they're receiving and processing and encoding information, so they might have a more intense or pensive look on their face. But this nonverbal style conveys certain information to the client which might be misinterpreted or misunderstood. So it's important that you are aware of your facial expressions and how you are maintaining eye contact and experiencing the information that the client is communicating. Sometimes, even though the person is really intent, and so the frown on their face might convey that they're really intent in listening, the client may misperceive that. So you might have to be more mindful of your facial expressions and your nonverbal communication. Vocal cues such as verbal rhythm and tempo, loudness and softness also conveys certain information. It's not exactly what you're saying, it's the mechanism by which you're saying it. So for example, if the client comes in and is crying about something that was painful that happened to them, as a clinician, you would soften your voice and you might say, you know, Jill, I can tell that this was a very painful experience for you. And it saddens me just hearing it because I can understand what that must have felt like. So you get into the moment with the client, and you get into the moment by having similar rhythms, tempos, and tone in your voice. So if the client is happy and gregarious, you wouldn't use a soft, demure voice. You would have a voice that is consistent with where the client is. So if the client is energetic and excited about something that happened over the weekend, you would match that voice. But if they would come in with something that was sad, that made them more sad and reflective, your voice and tempo would mirror theirs. And that's showing a level of complementary communication. Body language is another way by which we communicate with our client. Oftentimes, there are closed signs of communication. For example, if your arms are folded or your legs are crossed. Certain persons, our clients, will perceive that as a closed body language. I know for me, whenever I'm in an environment and I'm cold, I always fold my arms. So I have to be mindful when I'm working with clients and it's in a room where it's cold or cool. I have to make sure that I am not conveying in my body language that I'm closed. So that I might have to make sure that I have a sweater or a jacket, or have the temperature turned up so that I'm not so cold and my body language isn't closed. Silence is important in therapy, that we don't use too much verbiage. Some of us as clinicians are uncomfortable with silence. So because of it, we're always filling the space with verbiage. And there are times when we have to be silent to give the client an opportunity to speak. Also, when we are the client, the counselor is always filling the space with verbiage. It sets the tone where it's the client who is the listener and the counselor who is the communicator. So we have to be comfortable with silence. We have to pose an open-ended question and allow silence so that the client can be reflective and responsive. Sometimes we can cut a client off from thinking about things and understanding clearly the question before they respond if we're too quick to fill the time with other verbiage or following up with a secondary question. One of the things I find most with novice counselors is that they'll ask a question, and if the client doesn't answer in the time that they expect them to, which is quickly, then they will rephrase the question And usually the rephrasing of the question is with a closed-ended question. So they might say, "So tell me how your weekend was." And rather than allowing some silence for the client so that the client could think about how their weekend was and give you a more accurate answer, the counselor will say, "So tell me how your weekend was. So was it good? Did you have a good weekend? Did you do anything fun?" Each of those questions subsequent to the open-ended question was filled with closed-ended responses or questions that directed the client in terms of how they should respond. So be mindful to ask good open-ended questions and to use silence, which will allow the client to be reflective in their thinking and answering of your questions. Nonverbal communication also exists from a multicultural perspective. You will find that with certain clients, nonverbal communication takes on different meanings. For example, in the dominant culture, we arrive at certain perceptions when a client will look at us, make eye contact with us. There are some clients from certain cultural backgrounds where it might even be perceived as disrespectful to look at a person that's perceived to be in a position of authority, and counselors are perceived to be in a position of authority, with direct eye contact. So we have to make sure that we understand the nonverbal connotations from a multicultural perspective. If a client isn't giving us direct eye contact, it doesn't mean that they're being disrespectful. It might have something to do with their cultural context, the way in which they communicate nonverbally from a cultural context. There are some basic verbal skills that we must take into consideration from a counseling perspective. From a verbal perspective, we must allow the counselor to establish rapport. As counselors, we must establish rapport. We must communicate empathy and positive regard. And these factors begin the building of the working alliance with the client. So I have said a mouthful in this one statement. The basic skill in counseling is to establish rapport. You want to convey empathy and unconditional positive regard. And it's only when these three things take place do we build a working alliance with the client. I'm a firm believer, based upon my many years of experience with counseling, it's always important to have an exchange with a client from a very human perspective. One human being having a conversation with another, rather than this top-down means of communicating. Yes, as counselors, we are in a position of power. However, we have a responsibility to make clients feel comfortable. And one of the ways we make clients feel comfortable is to engage them from a very human perspective, conveying to them that we have empathy, we understand what their issues have been, and if we were in similar experiences, we too may have exhibited similar behavior, that we are not judging them, that we respect who they are irrespective of their life circumstances. And it's through conveying this information, be it from a nonverbal or a verbal perspective, that we build the working alliance. And through the working alliance, the client feels more comfortable sharing deeper, more positive kinds of information with the client. I'll never forget when I worked in this prison setting, And there was a young man who came in for me to provide information so that he would not be required to get in an elevator because he had claustrophobia and he had major problems when he was in an elevator. But because it wasn't documented, he came in and requested that I provide some kind of written documentation in his file so that he would not be forced to get into this close confines of an elevator. When he came in, just having an interest in understanding who this person is from a very interpersonal perspective, I started asking questions about, so tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How did things end up for you to be here? Just really engaging the person on a very human level. And within a 45-minute time frame, the client disclosed that he had issues related to childhood sexual abuse. I didn't anticipate receiving this information, and I'm sure the client didn't anticipate sharing this information. But my point to you is you will be amazed at the kind of information a client will share with you when you have established a good relationship. And the essence of a good relationship comes from having really good rapport, communicating empathy, having unconditional positive regard, and also conveying positive, healthy, nonverbal, having a nonverbal style of communicating. And through these methods of communication, you can build the working alliance to help the client move from where they are to where they need to be. And I want you to be mindful that this takes place even before the client has delved into some of their most deepest issues that are plaguing their lives. These issues related to rapport, empathy, and positive regard is the foundation by which we build the helping relationship. Counselors' verbal responses serve to facilitate client communication. So once you've moved beyond the nonverbal, the verbal information facilitates the client communication. So through the verbal responses, through the counselor's verbal responses, it will facilitate the client communicating with us. There are also times when minimal responses, reflection, paraphrase, and clarification will act to return the topic to focus and help the client to hear that we're paying attention and to allow us to convey greater meaning besides what the client has said. So, for example, sometimes you might say, okay. These responses, while minimal, convey to the client that we are hearing, we're paying attention, I'm following you, I understand, keep going, yes, I'm with you. So minimal responses are very powerful. There are also higher level kinds of responses, reflecting exactly what the client has said, reflecting it back to them. So the client says, wow, I had an awful weekend. So your weekend was pretty awful. And the client will say, yeah, it really was. All of these things kept happening and I thought it was the weekend from hell. And so a paraphrase might be, so it sounds like your weekend was fraught with one negative thing to another. Like you were just bombarded with all of these negative activities. And the client might say, exactly, that's exactly the kind of weekend I had. I felt like no matter what I did, it kept getting worse and worse. So I just decided on Sunday I would just stay in and avoid all contact with society because I was afraid that if I left my house, only the worst would happen. And as the counselor, you would say, so it sounds like you decided that it was your best course of action to stay home and avoid any interactions because it would only get worse. So that might be a paraphrase, but a clarification might have said. So tell me, what do you think would have happened if you would have decided to go outside your home instead of staying in, and your day actually or your weekend turned out better than it started out to be? So that's getting the client to clarify. Or you might say, tell me about what exactly happened in one of those situations where things went awry. And so the client will clarify exactly what happened. And through the clarification, the client will understand that, you know what, these issues have to be looked at individually. You can't lump them together. It wasn't just by circumstance these issues were happening. It was due to specific and certain behaviors. There are basic verbal skills of counseling. There are the minimal expressions, and these communicate attentiveness or interest, and that's similar to what we talked about a little bit ago with the okay, yeah. So the minimal expressions convey to the client that you're interested, you're paying attention, carry on, I'm listening. Reflection has to do with repeating a phrase or thought uttered by the client in the simplest response. So if they said, I had the worst weekend I have ever had in my entire life, and the reflection statement might be, you had some kind of weekend. And then the client will continue on by elaborating on exactly what kind of weekend they had. And so with paraphrasing, you rephrase the client's response using your own choice of words. There are essential questions that relate to verbal communication skills. The first is closed questions. And usually this has to do with very specific information that you're trying to obtain. Sometimes it's a yes or no. Sometimes it's yes, I live at 2417 and giving a specific street address. Sometimes it's a birth date, a date of birth. But this asks the client to respond with a minimal statement, usually a yes or no, or a bit of information. Open-ended questions, which are my favorite, and it means that we get a lot more information. It seeks to provide elaboration without specifying precisely what information is being sought. So through open-ended questioning, the client will provide elaborative kinds of information. And through elaborative information, you get a lot more information than you bargained for. And usually it gives you greater insight into what the client's problems are. And through your greater insight as the counselor, you can expand the knowledge base of your client. Clarification kinds of questions is when a counselor responds by seeking confirmation of what they're hearing. So for example, I might say to the client, can you help me to understand what went wrong on your job interview? Can you tell me about the interaction you had with your supervisor? Are you telling me that the altercation that happened with you and your coworker was because your coworker said something that you really didn't agree with? So you're asking some questions to clarify exactly what happened in a certain situation. You have a certain knowledge base, but you're wanting to have a better, more expansive understanding. So it's clarifying what was being communicated by the client. We also have advanced verbal skills of counseling. And these are the kinds of verbal skills that are used by counselors that are skilled clinicians. It involves intentionally going beyond the questions or the comments or the information that was presented by the client. It facilitates discussion and it solicits broader information. And one of the advanced verbal skills is a summary statement. Typically, it follows a client's discussion of events or circumstances. A summary is confirmation that the counselor is following the client's narrative, but reveal contradictions permitting a transition to a new topic or concern. Summary statements also focus on or highlights aspects of the client's narrative. Always at the end of a client-counselor interaction, at the end of the session, it's always important to provide a summary statement. So today, in today's session, we started off talking about the difficulty you had this weekend. Not only did you have problems with your spouse, you also had a negative interaction with your daughter, with the person in your neighborhood. And based upon those negative interactions, you decided that you would just stay in all day Sunday. But when we delved a little deeper in each of these situations, you did say that perhaps Sunday could have been an opportunity for creating new possibilities. So for next week, we will focus on other ways of handling difficult situations and not catastrophizing them. So what I just did here was provided you with information that allows you to hear the issue or the narrative that was conveyed from the client's perspective, and allow the client to go beyond what their thinking was, because sometimes clients are more narrow in their thinking, and as counselors, our role is not only to summarize what the client has said, but to take them beyond where they were in or where they are in their thinking. There's also a summary of feelings, and this brings together aspects of the client's shared feelings and can lead the client to deeper exploration or even a sense of completion. And this is known as catharsis. So in this situation, what you're doing is helping the client to understand their feelings associated with a situation. Because sometimes a client is not in tune with how they're feeling. And so through this summarization that's provided by you, the counselor, it's like an aha moment that this situation evoked certain feelings because of something else that happened that was very traumatic. So for example, I mentioned to you the client who came in because he was claustrophobic. Well, the fact of that situation was that the reason the client was claustrophobic is because he had been placed in situations where he felt that there was no escape. And one situation occurred when he was sexually abused at a young age. Another situation occurred when he was trapped in a refrigerator and almost died because there was no ventilation. So it's to help the client to understand the source of those feelings, and it can be very cathartic because they understand, they're able to connect the dots and glean greater understanding and awareness as it relates to those feelings. There's also a summary of content as it relates to advanced verbal skills. So in this situation, you're summarizing lots of details, facts, or even events related to the client's narrative, thereby revealing the total picture. So it's almost like you're connecting the dots for the client. You're connecting the dots in a way that once all the dots are connected, they're able to see the gestalt. So this client that I just spoke with you about, the client that had claustrophobia, this client had a severe drug addiction. And that drug addiction was actually being fueled by negative feelings regarding issues related to masculinity, issues related to abandonment, issues related to neglect and abuse. And so what you're doing when you're gleaning these important pieces of information, you're pulling these details, facts, and events together so that you can create a gestalt or a total picture. And it's through that total picture that you, the skilled counselor, is providing that allows the client to step back and see the totality of their issues. Oftentimes, clients see their problems in fragments. It was this problem, it was this relationship, it's my fear of the elevator. No, it's when I was trapped in the refrigerator as a child. No, it's when I was sexually abused by a trusted family members. And then when you collect all this information, tie it all together, collect the pieces, it's all of those factors that fuels their drug addiction and that keeps them in this vicious, unhealthy cycle. And when you understand the totality, it's from that point that you can help reconstruct meaning for that person and allow them to break the cycle and have a renewed sense of well-being. Other advanced verbal skills are the encouraging responses, and in these responses, they're meant to be supportive, to suggest that the client has the skill or potential to do something, or to feel a particular way, or to think in a different way. It's really, really important that we provide encouraging and affirming responses to our clients. You will be surprised at the difference these responses make to a client. There are times when I have provided encouraging and affirming responses, and the client will look at me and say, you know, I have never had anyone to say anything to me that was so positive. I've never had anybody to tell me that I was capable of doing something, that within me lies the ability to go beyond my current circumstances. I believe in affirming my clients and encouraging my clients, no matter what environment I'm working in, whether it's a counseling center, a rehabilitation facility, or as a professor. I always find opportunity to encourage, affirm, and inspire, because you will be surprised those responses will give that client the energy that they need to take their game to a whole new level. So as it relates to this slide, it says that it is phrased as statements that imply or suggest that the client has the ability or the potential to act in a different way. The second advanced verbal skill that's on this page is confrontation or challenge. And oftentimes people perceive this as a negative. They perceive it as you saying something mean to a client. But sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So first of all, let's look at what confrontation or challenge is. The confrontation or challenge is effective in instances in which the client is experiencing but not acknowledging a condition, a belief, or feelings that is part of the presenting problem. So for example, you might have a client who says to you, I want a job, I really want to work, I really want a job. But then when you say to the client, tell me what a typical day looks like for you, you'll learn that the client sleeps until 10 or 11. They play video games most of the day. They stay up until late at night playing video games. They haven't put out a single resume or completed an application. And so you would say, as the counselor, after hearing what a typical day is like, and also hearing the client say that they really want a job, you would say, you know, Johnny, I hear you saying to me that you really want a job, that you really want to find a job and you want to work. However, I'm also hearing you say that a typical day for you is when you get up at 10, you start off by playing videos, you stay up until 2 or 3 a.m., and then you wake up the next day at 10 or 11. And this behavior does not convey to me that you're interested in finding a job. And so what I'd like for us to do is talk about effective behaviors that would correlate with you finding a job. So what you're doing in this instance is you're pointing out the discrepancy. While on the one hand, you're saying you want a job, on the other hand, your behavior suggests that you don't want a job. And so if a person is truly interested in finding a job, you will assist them as their counselor in identifying behavior and engaging in behavior that will support what they're telling you verbally. Additional advanced verbal skills are interpretation responses. And in this situation, you will interpret what the client is saying, because sometimes we have to read between the lines. So an interpretation response is when you are skilled in reading between the lines. And so your responsibility in reading between the lines is to give an interpretation or an interpretive response. And it proposes or assigns meaning to an event, condition, or feeling that the client is experiencing. And sometimes these interpretive responses will take the client to a place of understanding that they may not be aware of. Directive responses. This involves assignments to do or to think in a specified manner, and it usually involves homework assignments. So you might say to the client, I want you to go through the newspaper and circle jobs that you are most interested in, and come back tomorrow, or when you come back next week, we'll go over those jobs and we'll talk about whether you have the skills and abilities to do the job. So with the directive responses, we are assigning things that the client must do, or we're getting them to think about things in a way in which they haven't thought about it before. There's also informative responses, and these are used primarily when information is missing that the client requires in order to act or to think in a particular way. So you're providing them with information. So for example, in some of the work that I've done with HIV prevention, getting people to understand the ways in which alcohol might enhance their risky sexual behavior is more of an informative response. So I might say to someone, you know, alcohol has a tendency to cause you to do risky behavior that you may not have intended on. And so through this informative response or providing this information, the client will be aware in future situations that, you know what, I have to avoid alcohol in situations that might place me at risk for doing something. So that's more of an informative kind of response, providing them with information. And so that concludes our discussion on the counseling process. What I've done is provided you with a gestalt, a way by which to understand some of the foundational kinds of information that goes into the counseling process. And I want to really emphasize the fact that the process begins with the relationship. Research shows that it is the relationship that dictates the extent to which you will positively enhance the lives of your clients. So focus first and foremost on building good rapport and good relationship. And through the relationship, you can have the kind of alliance with your client that will allow you to forge ahead through the counseling process to positively impact change, not just within one situation, but there will be a ripple effect in the life of the client. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to having more conversations in lecture number 2.